Good afternoon and welcome to day 3 of the Defending the Early Years 2021 Virtual Summer Institute. I might be a little biased, but I feel we might have saved the best for last. My name is Denisha Jones, and I have the privilege of serving as the co-director of Defending the Early Years. And today we're focusing on how do we build a more equitable early childhood, thinking about issues of liberation and freedom and justice for all children and all families. And so we're really excited to bring this conversation to you. It's a big part of the work that we've been doing at Defending the Early Years, the work that I am allowed to do, working with such an amazing team that really believes in centering the voices and the needs of all children and all families, and especially those who have been historically excluded from quality early childhood education. So today we're going to begin with a keynote discussion, and then we will transition into a panel. So I'm going to introduce our keynote, and then she's going to speak and give her presentation, and there'll be prompts in the chat for you to respond to. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will address those questions while we're chatting with the panelists as well too. After the Q&A, each panelist will respond briefly to the remarks from our keynote, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll turn to the questions from the audience. So we are in for an amazing 2 hours, and to begin, we have Takima Bunch-Smith, who is the president and founder of, I should have asked you first, Takima Anasha, did I say that right?
It is ANASA Educational Consulting.
Awesome, ANASA Educational Consulting, and she is the executive director of the Center on Culture, Race, and Equity at Bank Street College. Takima envisions and builds a culture of anti-oppression and racial equity for children and adults in all that she does. She has authored and co-authored articles for the Washington Post and Chalkbeat, New York, and is the founder of the Black Lives Matter at School Early Childhood Symposium, and leads a team at Bank Street College to provide research-based and practice-proven professional development to support schools and districts to become anti-racist and culturally responsive. Takima holds 3 master's degrees in early childhood and elementary education from Bank Street College of Education, Urban Education Policy from the CUNY Grad Center, and from NYU's Wagner School for Public. Takima participated in our 2020 Summer Institute last year, and I'm so delighted that she's come back here to be our keynote. I was really impressed when she did the first Black Lives Matter at School Early Childhood Symposium. It was just so exciting, and it's been an amazing event to see it grow and be able to participate this past year. It was just awesome. So thank you so much for being here, Takima, and we are very excited for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Denisha. I just also have to thank you for your early childhood energy and enthusiasm that you bring to a day where it is about 103 degrees outside in the shade. It's always a pleasure to participate in events like this and to be surrounded by folks that are doing all this work, essentially to liberate children from the very beginning. So what I'm going to do is Denisha's going to share some slides, some images, so you can look more at those than at me. You can also listen because we know we want to support people who learn through different modalities. So we've got visual, we've got audio, and you're also going to be thinking and using your fingers, I hope, today. Thank you, Denisha. So we can go to the next slide. That would be 2.5-year-old Takima on the right. And just to remind folks that my pronouns are she and her. Today, I just want to let you know that I have about 30 to 40 minutes. It's not enough time. As we start talking, you will see that I'm going to cover a lot of topics. I'm not going to go as deep into them as I would like to. Luckily, we've got an amazing set of panelists that will continue discussing and sharing and deepening this conversation. And more importantly, you have yourselves, and your commitment by being here tells me and tells all of us that you are interested in equity, which is lifelong work. And so never fear if it feels too much, too soon, too fast, and unfinished, because that is actually the work that we're doing today. So because this is a webinar format, I can't see all of you and I can't see body language. And so I need to hear from you in the chat. When I ask questions or prompts, I will say them and they will also be written into the chat. I'd love it if, as you were able, you respond. And also, as I'm speaking, if questions come up for you about things that I'm speaking about, you can put them in the Q&A feature. And if you have shout outs or responses, like if you're someone who listens to people talk like I am and you go, that's right, I know that, or what? You can even put that in the chat because that's what we have. We're going to use the medium and we're going to be our full selves. So I'm encouraging you to really do that. You could also communicate with each other that way. So next up, I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the identities that I hold that I, sort of am leading with, or that rise to the top, that are important for this conversation today. So I am at heart an early childhood educator. I began teaching 3-year-olds who turned 4, then moved up with them to teach 4-year-olds who became 5, and then I went to teach first grade where they were 5 and 6, and I actually taught 8-year-olds in 3rd grade. And now my work primarily is teaching or supporting and facilitating learning experiences for adults. I'm also a mom to someone who was an infant, toddler, in a preschool, and who is now a teenager who is currently out of the house babysitting a 10-year-old, which is amazing for me to watch that happen. I am a Black American and Haitian American woman, a born and bred 4th generation New Yorker and Brooklynite, and that's a huge part of my identity that I bring with me everywhere. And I'm celebrating my grandmother's 92nd birthday tomorrow. And so we are doing a lot of deep dive into Brooklyn in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and beyond to share that experience with her. And I think it's also critical that you all know that I was a student of Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum at Mount Holyoke College beginning in 1993. I took the Psychology of Racism course with her, which kind of changed my life, and then continued to do my thesis with her as one of my advisors. And I ended up doing my thesis back in 1995 when I graduated, looking at 5 white women's racial identity development through the intervention of a multicultural education course. And so one of the reasons why I like to tell people about this is because I've been doing this a long time, and I'm still doing it. I'm still learning, still growing. And as a friend from college told me, if you were doing any job, whether it was clerical, whether it was you were a gardener, you would be thinking about the intersections of race, class, gender, and identity, no matter what, because it truly became a part of my entire outlook on life. And so that is one of the important lenses that I'm bringing to this conversation today. I see people starting to use the chat, so thank you so much. I can multitask, but I'll wait till I can take a pause and look at what some of the things are coming up in there. So on the next slide, really the point of what I wanted to share with you all today is a recipe for building an equitable early childhood. And the reality is that we all like recipes, especially when it comes to tough things of figuring out identity, right? We kind of want to know, what do we do? How do we fix it? Give us the steps and then we'll do it and then we'll be done. Not quite how it works around equity, but we're doing this work to begin, right? Okay, so Denisha, when you click, there's going to be the question that I think you already put in the chat that came up. What are some of your identities, right? So just click once. You've got animation on the slides. Hopefully that works. Okay, that's okay. You can keep it. I think, let me just check if you put it in the chat. I just want to make sure. Yes, what are your identities? Exactly. Okay, so I'm inviting you to just think about identities that are rising to the top for you, and you can put them in the chat. And so this recipe, it's important that, a few things, some notes. It's one recipe. It's not the only one that's out there. But I do want you to know that this recipe that I've kind of developed is based on over 25 years of my work in this field of reading, of learning, of listening, teaching, and being in community with and for children, educators, leaders, researchers, policymakers, parents, and most of all, and more recently, disruptors in early childhood. And so this recipe that I'm going to share with you is really focused on the adults in early childhood, because that's where we have to begin and where we have to continually return to, because we are the stewards of the work. And so who we are and how we show up and what we do and what we know and what we don't know makes the difference in being able to create equity. So the ingredients for this recipe, right? You need your full selves and all of your identities, understanding which parts of your identities give you privilege and power and which parts you experience marginalization for. You need to have a sense of your whole self in the context of the United States. You also need to have a sense of curiosity and wondering why, how did this happen? How did this get to be? What else could happen? How else could it look? You have to maintain a stance of curiosity. And with that, you need reflectiveness, right? Always thinking back. And what does this mean for who I am and for what I believe and for what I'm doing in this world? And really importantly, you have to be willing to become uncomfortable and to also know that you are going to fail. That is part of any work towards dismantling oppression, but you can't stop there. You just have to recommit when you fail to do that reflection of understanding why you failed and how you can do it differently the next time. So then once you think about those ingredients, think about these steps. Number one, reflecting. Number two, interrogating. Number three is going to magically appear when Denisha clicks. Centering. And number four, creating. And so there are so many details that could go into each step of this recipe. But for today, I'm highlighting just a few. So reflecting on our understandings of equity, of socialization, academic socialization, and other socialization like racial socialization, understanding what that means and how we participate in it as preschool people or early childhood people. Interrogating, what do I know about white supremacy culture and whiteness and anti-blackness and dominant culture and values? How have I participated in it? How do I disrupt it? What does this mean in my personal life? And what does it mean for my practice with children and families? So we really have to constantly do this work of unpacking. And then we need to think about who and what and how are we centering? And so there are some frameworks that can help us center those that have been historically excluded, those people with identities that have been historically excluded. And so culturally responsive education, anti-bias, anti-racist education, whole child, holistic educational experiences, and joy and care is the foundation for all of it. And I really, really mean that, because we do not talk about and center joy and care enough for anyone in this country, and particularly for young children. And then we've got to think about how do we use all of these things, 1, 2, and 3, to create a personal vision for equity. Personal, like living your lives. Because equity is not something you can wake up and do from 8 to 4, Monday to Friday with 3-year-olds, right? This is the life. And so your personal vision, your professional plan of action, the steps you're going to take, and also your commitment and recommitment to doing intersectional work, right? This is really, really, really important. So this is, these are the pieces of the recipe. And let's jump in. So we're going to go to the next slide, please, Tanisha. And we're going to look at each of these and we'll just do a little bit. So reflecting. The first thing is, what is equity? So I think this should pop up a question for the chat. How do you define equity in early childhood? How do you define it? Go ahead and start adding into the chat. How do you define equity in early childhood? Denisha, if you click, that will come up. And the next thing, right? And so as you're starting to think about that and type into the chat, I'm gonna offer for you a nice definition that came from the Children's Equity Project, released a report. The link is there. We'll put it into the chat, but it's on the bottom. And it was a report that was written talking about early childhood equitable systems, right? And by systems, we mean everybody. Everyone has to be a part of the system, right? So we're not just talking about teachers or policymakers or children or families, it's everyone together. And so equitable early childhood systems provide access to resources and opportunities to children and families that result in positive outcomes that are not associated with children's demographic characteristics. And I think what is hard for people to understand, because we just don't talk openly about it in general in our culture, is that we live in a society that has racially and identity predictable outcomes for children. If you look at all the evidence and the data throughout we've been looking at systems since they, began, we can see that there are consistently groups of children or people whose identities experience harm and do not get to thrive and reach their full potentials, right? So that's Black children, Latinx children, children whose English is not their first language, disabled children, gender non-conforming children, LGBTQ children, and families, right? And so we've got to get to a place where we don't look at someone and say, because you have this identity, we can generally predict that you will not be able to live your best life. And so when we are thinking about equity, we have to actively and continuously identify and intentionally eliminate manifestations of systemic racism and other forms of oppression. And the key word here is intentional. It does not go away because we don't like it or because we don't want to believe that it exists. We have to be intentional about changing what we have. And thank you so much for adding your definitions. I really, really appreciate it. Here is an example of inequity in early childhood. I have notes to kind of keep me going as well. So for young children to not see their identities, meaning their race, their first language, their disabilities, their family structure, or gender identity reflected at all in their classroom library, or if they are reflected, it's a single story, or it's not positive, or it's not layered. That's an example of inequity. And so it's something very concrete that we could think about and say it shouldn't actually be that way. So just recognizing that early childhood, these inequities begin before children are born, and they continue as they touch into the early childhood system. So next, I want to just go to another part of reflecting, which is just thinking about socialization. This is something I've really been thinking about a lot. I think about a lot of things a lot, but recently I've been thinking a lot about socialization because I think it would be so helpful if we really, really understood it more. And so this is not a sociology course. Strongly recommend that you go and look into more about socialization. But generally speaking, socialization is the process of internalizing the norms and ideologies of society. Now, schools are one of the major sites of socialization. And so you can look up agents of socialization. They include parents, schools, the media, etc. So if you click, Denisha, you'll see a little image that shows that the child, right, we're just going to focus on these two pieces, is socialized first by their family, and then as soon as they step foot into a formal educational system as two socializing agents. And it's interesting, much of what I've seen has been the arrows that show the family socializing the child and the education systems socializing the child. But I've also really thought about what impact does the child have on the family and the educational system. And the fact that we don't have that much of a conversation speaks to the view, generally speaking, culturally, of children in the society, that they don't have something to offer or have an impact on us, but they absolutely do. And so something to really think about. So preschools are major sites of socialization for young children, right? They teach children both explicitly and also implicitly the dominant culture's values, accepted behaviors, and expectations of the society, which in this case, we're talking about the United States. So keep this in mind when you start to think about what type of society do we have, that then when children walk into school, they get socialized into that society by default without anybody thinking about it. because socialization happens without anyone knowing. No one's like, oh my goodness, you just told me to step away and give you space. And so now I'm socializing to understand this amount of space is appropriate. You don't say that, you don't think it, it just happens. And then you just grow up and think, ooh, somebody got too close to me, because you were socialized to think that, right? You need X amount of space. So something to really, really think about. So socialization happens around every area of identity. And so racial socialization, which is the next click, is something that also happens beginning at birth and definitely in preschool, whether or not anyone knows that it's happening. So racial identity, just to define, is the meaning that each of us has constructed or constructs about what it means to be a person of color or a white person in a race-conscious society. And this is Dr. Tatum's definition. So just to be clear, we live in a race-conscious society. We live in a racist society. And so without intervention, children will begin to internalize racism, and that means children of color. And white children begin to internalize racial superiority at early ages. And I just want to share that if this feels like a hard statement for people to listen to, I want you to think about what it feels like for yourself as an adult now, thinking back, for example, over 2020, and think about how many times you came to a new understanding of yourself as a racial being, or people around you, or you've gone back and revisited conversations and interactions. That's because you were socialized, and then there was an incident or a number of incidents that happened in particular in 2020. They've always been happening, but maybe people didn't notice them in the same way, and it triggers you to go into a different stage of racial identity, and is connected to socialization. So again, without intervention, remember the last slide, without being intentional, children as young as 3 years old begin to internalize racism and racial superiority. Louise Derman Sparks and Patty Ramsey, who is another advisor of mine at Mount Holyoke College, have written a lot about this if you want to learn more. Next slide, please. Great. So just for people to know that there are other forms of socialization, and you can think about those and add them into the chat. Essentially, I'll give you the answer. It aligns with every part of identity. So we get socialized around gender identity and around sexual orientation. Exactly what it means to be a girl or boy is called gender identity, or a gender nonconforming child. If you don't feel like a boy or a girl, like then that bucks up against the socialization into a gender binary society that all children are put into. I just read yesterday in my neighborhood, which is supposed to be a very progressive neighborhood, a parent was complaining that boys and girls were separated at camps. And then a few other people were like, yeah, that's happening. And people were like, why is that happening? What's the purpose of it? But it happened. I mean, I grew up having that experience, but it's about socialization. And then we get to change it as we understand that it can cause a lot of harm. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is interrogate. And I'm gonna like talk really fast, but maybe not too fast because this is a lot. So interrogating, remember I talked about this step of really digging deep to process these concepts that are actually guiding our lives in the United States and in our work with young children and families in ways that we may not even understand. And even if we have sort of thought about it, trust me, there's always something else to uncover. You know, I wake up every week and I go, oh my goodness, I did not realize that I was adhering to whiteness. That I felt this way because of what I was socialized into around whiteness. So whiteness is one thing, and the second thing is anti-blackness, which we'll go into next. But briefly, whiteness and white racial identity refer to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as a standard by which all other groups are compared. So this is the core of race in America. And this is an opinion. This is actually what the quote unquote founders of America wrote about. So you can just go look at their documents where they talked about it and then created a census that gave value to white lives and not to people of it. It created the idea of race in the first place, but those that they deemed other races. And so that's just a fact. They were very clear about setting up a society that would hold to this. And so because it's been around for 400 or 500 years, 500 years or more, it's been normalized throughout our history and throughout our society, so that we just see whiteness as normal. And then we see other people's identities as abnormal or weird or less than, right? And this is actually the default setting in every institution, in every educational space, and also in early childhood, teacher ed, research, curriculum assessment, child development theories, notions of family engagement, and the way we implement programs. So maybe I should take a breath. For some of you that might not be new, but for some of you are like, what are you talking about, Takima? Well, that's what I told you in the beginning. You got work to do, okay? This is a lot. There's a lot of information about it. There are people that are doing this work. In particular, I will share the name of Ujama Jordan and Kate Engel. Are some folks who have presented on this. And so this is important for you to do, continue to do your research and really understand if that's the default setting. Let me first figure out what that actually means in my daily work in this field, or if I'm parenting a young child. And Megan Madison has also done this work as well. So I'll put some links in the chat when I'm done talking. Okay, so we're gonna interrogate anti-blackness in like 3 minutes or less. And this one is not because 3 minutes, because we don't need more time, but because I don't wanna go on too long, because we have amazing panelists after as well. And so just to be clear, anti-blackness is the simultaneous dehumanization of Black people, and it's also the systematic marginalization of Black people. So the devaluing of Black lives, Black people, Blackness, Black culture, anything that is connected to Black people is both marginalized and dehumanized and seen as not having value, except when it can be commodified. So that's a whole nother conversation. It's held in place by structural and systemic racism, which is often covert. Like, we don't necessarily see it, it just is there. But segregated neighborhoods where Black people experience lesser access to resources is a perfect example of how anti-Blackness has been supported by structures and systems. And so these things predetermine the socioeconomic and also the educational status and outcomes of Black people in this country. And so we have to look at institutions, behaviors, and ideologies and policies to really think about how do we unpack this. So anti-Blackness and whiteness go hand in hand. And again, it's like acid rain on early childhood, on preschool. And so there's something that I wanted to share. There is a book by Hari Ziad called Black Boy Out of Time. And I started reading this book a couple of months ago, and I stopped on this page and was sobbing. And so I actually have not gotten much farther in the book because I have been grappling with this concept. And I wanted to share it with you, not because I have it figured out, but because I want to offer it to you also as a model of what it means to grapple with and work through painful and difficult concepts in the service of equity and liberation for all children. And so this is a quote from his book. And I'll tell you this, I didn't write it here because it was way too many words, but he starts out saying, misopedia is a word meaning the hatred or disdain of children, but there is no commonly understood word in this language for the specific way this hatred manifests in the lives of Black children. And he continues, there's no commonly shared word to describe why our children are so uniquely harmed by everything from healthcare inequity to lack of access to education. Why our children are so constantly gunned down in the streets by police. And so he continues, I offer misafropedia to mean the anti-Black disdain for children and childhood that Black youth experience. As a term, misafropedia helps me to describe the systematic oppression and disdain for Black children, a disdain that culminates in discarding Black children's existence. And then he continues, their existence is literally discarded in the abuse and incarceration of Black children within systems such as the school to prison pipeline. And you should be clear that there is a preschool to prison pipeline. When police handcuffed 6-year-old Kaya Roll and held her in a detention center for throwing a tantrum in class in 2019. And it is discarded figuratively in how the state attempts to indoctrinate Black people into abusing and disregarding our own childhood natures to pursue idolized binary concepts of manhood or womanhood. And so I offer this to you to, get his book if you want to, look at his website, like think about this and talk about it. If you're a parent with your own children, and I mean all parents, not just Black parents. If you're a preschool educator, get this into a staff room and start talking about it, because you cannot disrupt it and dismantle it if you're not actually talking about it. So next up, just to be super clear, again, with the intentionality. Thank you. The name of the book is Black Boy Out of Time. And I will, again, when I'm done, I will go back and put links to things that I'm mentioning in the chat for you. So this is the clear thing that we know. We know this from research, we know this from practice, we know this from the moral standing, is that we can either perpetuate inequities in preschool or we can disrupt them. There's just no middle ground. And so if we go into preschools thinking we're going to be nice and we're going to teach our kids to be friends and we're going to, make sure kids always feel good all the time, that's great. But we're actually continuing to perpetuate inequities if we don't pair that with ourselves as adults processing and understanding the work that we are doing to create an equitable early childhood and then world, and also think about how do we support children to participate in this disruption as well. And we absolutely can in really big and small ways. And I know that some of our panelists are going to talk about some of these ways later in a little bit. And so the next part of the recipe is centering. And so this one, oh my goodness. I have to confess, because I'm like a heart on my sleeve kind of person, I've cried like 6 times in the last 2 days because I think it's been a lot that I've been holding for a long time, like many of us, and I'm starting to thaw out. But someone supports me to make my slides, and she showed these to me, and I was like sobbing. I was like, yes, baby. Right? Because this looks like my son. Like I have photos of my son at this age. And I remember that joy of just like, he did not know there was oppression, like I created my family, our community, we just created a space where he was just there. And he was able to be himself, and he still is now, but he has been sobered by the society that we live in, both educationally as well as the world. But just to remember, the centering pieces, we're going to center culturally responsive education. We're going to center anti-bias and anti-racist education. We're going to center the whole child. And so you cannot have equity in early childhood if children are not being children. Okay, so we're not doing the skills, drills, the worksheets, the homework at 2 and 3. That ain't liberation and that ain't equity. And it's definitely not the case for Black, Indigenous, and other children of color, which the narrative is often that we need it more. No, we don't. They need play.
Cancel?
I think you liked it. I'll put you back in there.
You're gentle.
They're chickies. What are they doing? They're so silly. Where are we going to put them?
On the burner, inside the house.
Okay.
Beautiful. This is a baby whose mother has divested from the formal education system because of the challenges that I have outlined in terms of socialization for her child. And so Nikolai Pizarro has created the Liberatorium Forest School in her backyard in Atlanta. And so this is her 4-year-old who is unschooled and forest schooled. And she is a Black Latina woman. So just to kind of think, we can have this everywhere. You don't have to unschool to provide this for children. And in fact, We have to provide this for children in preschools, in schools, and in early childhood. Every child should look like this little boy on the left for like most of the day, except when they're going through their normal emotions, right? Might be crying, might be sad, that's fine too, but this is really the goal. Okay, so next up, we're gonna think about creating a vision, right? Because we've been talking a lot. We got our culturally responsive education. Yes, click a few more times. Anti-bias, anti-racist, absolutely. Whole child, art, music, dance, sleep. Get the nap ministry in preschool, and joy and care. And then we're gonna create our vision. So that'll be on the next slide. And just being clear that when we think about equity in early childhood, we want to understand what people need and give them what they need to enjoy full and healthy lives. That is the bottom goal. We are not in preschool worried about kids getting in Harvard. We shouldn't be. If they go to Harvard, that's fine, but we're not doing that to all kids. Okay, they have the inalienable right to be their full, healthy, joy-filled selves. And that has to begin in early childhood. And so I just want to point out, as you are creating your vision and you're living and doing the work of your vision, you are going to have to do some re-socialization of yourself. And I think that's where people get stuck. And that's why I wanted to share with you a little bit of information about socialization and really encourage you to continue looking into it, is because it's like you have to discard things that you've grown up with, patterns, beliefs, ways of behaving, and then you have to have new ways of being, right? How am I taking up too much space as a heterosexual woman in this moment? Let me step back, because I'm used to being centered. I'm used to seeing myself represented. Now I've got to step back and listen to other voices, right? And to diminish that part of myself a bit, because it's been unnaturally built up at the expense of others, of people who are queer. And so that's like one example, but you can do it for all of your parts of your identity. And so that's work that I literally have been doing. Remember I talked about you got to be ready to fail. I failed so many times. I'm like, oh my goodness, there I went centering myself again. Oh, let me step back. Let me keep learning. I'm just going to keep coming back, because the goal is liberation for everyone, right? If I'm free and everyone isn't free, then we're not all free. Okay. And so just really think about that. And know that when you start to re-socialize and question all of these things, you often will get a lot of pushback. So the pushback isn't the problem. How you respond, right, and keep your vision, your ultimate goal and vision for equity centered, is the thing that will shore you up to continue standing up in the face of the pushback, right? And so it's long, ongoing, lifetime work. So I just want to point that out. It's just not so simple, but it's still necessary. So on the next slide, just the last reminder that I don't know about you, but definitely me and in my culture, when I asked my grandmother, how do I make your special beans and rice recipe? She's like, okay, well, you get you some onions, and you put some, and I'm like, well, how much? You've heard this before. How much? She's like, I don't know, just, put water, put your hand in to see how much for what? Yes. So it's a guide. It's not a rule. So you can take some of the things that I've shared, and then you have to adjust them, because your ingredients include you and your identity and where you're coming from and where you're going. And so you've got to adjust it and make it your own journey. You're also going to enhance it, because I've given kind of a framework, but the reality is there's so much more. And so you can have your basic apple pie recipe. I was thinking about this when I was working as a threes assistant teacher, and we used to cook with the children. And I have Anna's apple pie recipe. It was a mom who came in and she said, let's do cooking with the kids. And I still use this recipe because I cannot figure out how to make dough on my own. So it's like using store-bought. It's great. But at a certain point in my life, I might not want to just use the store-bought, pie crust and make my own dough. So you can enhance it. You can add more ingredients, more concepts, layer it, deepen intersectionality, deepen the perspective, talk to more people. That's, what you're going to do with any work that you're doing. And then you might need to reconfigure, because these steps are not like linear. You don't just, I'm going to do this, and then I'll create my guide. No, you can create your plan, and then still keep going back to that interrogation and still keep going back to that centering. And so it has to make sense for who you are and where you are in this world. And like any good recipes, it's no fun if you eat alone, especially when the food is good. And so sharing and doing this work in community is the thing that will sustain you. This is not individual work to do the work of equity. In fact, you will burn out quickly and like go, work in a bank. And banks are fine, but if you want to be doing early childhood equity, then you want to shore yourself up and create the best possible conditions for success. And so share, do this work in community, lift each other up, hold each other accountable, and keep your eyes focused on the prize and the vision that every child deserves to be free and whole and nurtured at the earliest of ages. And a society needs to change to become equitable, to receive them in that way. And so one click, please, Denisha. Ubuntu, I am because we are, is a Zulu proverb that the spirit just popped in and said, this is what I need to share with you. So I shared it with you. And here's the last thing. I think we made it sort of a little bit late, but I kind of got it in. I want all 101 of you to be change agents in early childhood, and I want you to get 100 more people and 100 more people so that in my lifetime, very selfishly, I can see this field shift toward equity for young children, and for young children to grow up and not to have to unlearn, right, and figure out how to center themselves and do all the things that we want. We can create this for them at birth. And so I created a Padlet, which will go into the chat. And I would love for you to share your vision for equity in early childhood on the Padlet. And if you are at a point where you cannot or choose not to share, I would also love to hear just like, what's your next steps? And I would encourage you to make it a SMART goal because you know what that does. It helps you be more successful. So I'm really thinking that, by September, what is something that you want to work on in terms of your plan towards building a more equitable early childhood? I'm going to keep the Padlet open so you can respond today, tomorrow. I'll take a look at it over the weekend. And I would love to engage with you. So you can email me at info@anasa.com. And a SMART goal is, specific, measurable, I think actionable, but somebody can correct me. What's the R? I can't remember the R and I can't remember the T, but attainable. Thank you, Denisha. And related. Yes, it's so funny. I've said it so many times and I can make one and time bound, right? So by September, you will do a specific thing that you can then in September say, this is what I did over the last 2 months to work towards my goal. So it's an acronym, and we love acronyms in early childhood, but SMART isn't from our field. Thanks for asking, April. So that is it for me, and I thank you so much for engaging with me. Thank you so much.
Takima, as always, you just set the stage for everything we need to talk about. Thank you so much. That was I learned so much. And, I'm teaching my 3 the development class this summer. We talk about Bronfenbrenner. You even opened up my eyes to really looking at Bronfenbrenner in deeper ways last summer. Here you are again. We're going to go into it tonight in our last class as we make our bioecological models and we talk about disrupting the myths of cultural poverty. You've given me so much to think about in addition to that. And I think everyone here has agreed that you've given us so much to think about. So I just want to take a breath and thank you for your amazing work, just on behalf of all children, but just the way you really asked us to think deeply about what we do and why we do it. It's just so needed at this time. It can't be about just test scores in college. It's got to be about more than that. And the way you share your love for your son and your family. I've met your mom. Wait, was it your mama or your grandma? That maybe both of them at the event. Yeah, and so it's just been really amazing to have you in this space. Thank you so much. And And I hope you'll stick around for the panel. I mean, there's just so much to talk about. I'm going to bring them in shortly, but you gave us so much to think about. And I think it's so important, this idea of centering Black joy, right? And this is a question I get a lot from my students, right? Like, well, what do you mean? What does it mean to teach to Black joy and to center Black joy? And so I want us to think about that as we talk on the panel, like, what does that look like? And then care, which is so important, right? I was just in a debate the other day that, well, we can't convince society to pay people for caring for people's children because that's not that important. I'm like, actually, developmental care, not custodial care, which yes, anybody can engage in custodial care. We know this, but developmental care that supports the development of a person is a very important field. And it does take skills and it takes a disposition and an attitude. So I wanted to think about those two things, right? As we transition to our panel, centering joy and centering care. And so panelists, how are we feeling? I know, Megan, you were thinking about maybe taking a break. How are you feeling? Do we need to center, to ground ourselves for a minute here, or are we ready to get into this? All right, I hope that was grounding for everyone. I'm super excited to kick off our panel discussion. So up first, we have Ashley Brailsford, who's the founder of our Joyful Learning. Ashley, the longtime educator and nature enthusiast who launched Community to help nature-connected organizations transform their programs to be more culturally relevant and inclusive of honoring culture, exploring well-being, and inspiring joy. She began her teaching career as an elementary Montessori teacher before becoming an early childhood professor. While working in higher education and later as a nonprofit director of family literacy programs across the country, much of her teaching and research interests were grounded in family engagement and building trust in culturally, racially, and linguistically diverse communities. I've had the pleasure of working with Ashley for almost a year now. I think that was last summer when we met through the Tasty Project, and we've presented together, and I'm so inspired by the work that she does. I wish I can get her closer to me and I didn't have to come. Are you in Tennessee or North Carolina normally? I forget.
Tennessee.
Tennessee, yeah. Well, when I do get out there, we'll definitely be checking you out. So Ashley's going to offer a response in general to what we just, all the wonderful information Takima shared and how, that centers in your work.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Takima, thank you so much for your presentation, because I think all of which you talked about, that whole recipe, was the phases that I've been going through for sure. And particularly last year, even before the pandemic hit, there was a sense of, as the new year came, of me going into a very deep reflection about what I wanted for my own son to experience in his education. At the time, he was in kindergarten, and I wasn't happy about what he was receiving and experiencing. And I was in a position or in a job where I wasn't happy about how we were doing the work in communities that were predominantly of color. And so last year gave me a lot of time to do some deep reflection and some deep interrogating of my own journey into what I wanted for myself and for my son and for all children. And so I like to say I was liberated from my job in April. And with that liberation came the opportunity to really dig deeper into what I really wanted to do and what was heart-centered. And that was joy. I literally told myself, I said, whatever I do next, I know at the center of it has to be joy, and has to be also this connection to nature. So as a hobby, so to speak, all this time, for many years, I've been engaged with the national organization Outdoor Afro that seeks to reconnect Black people to the outdoors. And so what started to happen during the pandemic was I was spending a lot of time outside doing this reflection, right? And with my son, it was like, yes, school's out, we're done, cool, that's fine by me, we'll go just play. And so we did, and we just spent so much time outside, and it was so invigorating, it was so joyful. And so when I said, my next thing that I'll do has to center joy, that's how the name came about, our Joyful Learning Community. And it needed to be in community with other folks who understood the importance of not just, being outside for the sake of being outside, or in nature for the sake of being in nature, but it needed to center our stories, and it needed to center our roles in nature, because we've become disconnected in many ways from the idea that we belong in that space, right? And we belong in nature. And I started digging into nature education, and that's not my background, right? Like I've been a lot like Takima and Denisha and the rest of us here on the panel, in this early childhood space, which has its own work, right? And then nature education is kind of off doing its own thing. And what I started looking at when I looked into nature education more was, there were these areas that were often talked about, and it was more so, okay, what kind of materials can we bring into the classroom that are, sticks and pebbles and things like that? Or if we talked about nature and children are wild and they get to be free, I was like, well, where's that for our children, right? Where's that for us? And on top of that, where are our stories connected to that? And so it was often presented as we're out in the outdoors for the sake of the outdoors, but there was very few connections and intentional connections being made to Native Americans' place and space and contributions to the outdoors, and as well as Black folks and Latinx folks and Asian folks. And so what I did and what I've been excited about this past year was to say, okay, let's take these opportunities of our stories and uplifting the goodness is what I like to call it. I learned that from one of my dear colleagues, Perigene Yazzie-Mintz, who did a lot of work with Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, and the importance of telling stories, right? And creating these powerful stories. And so I said, okay, I have to look at where the goodness is. That's what I'm going to focus on, right? Instead of focusing on all the things, right, that we see, nature isn't a part of Black children's lives. That's often the narrative. And I'm like, well, yeah, it is. It's just may not look like what it's portrayed to be, with children being out in these, parks out in the wild. And so I've been spending a lot of time kind of reshaping and shifting what that portrait of what it means to engage in nature looks like. And so what I do with families and get to do with families is not only the centering, but for me, Takima was this creation, that fourth phase, right, of what it means to have nature education. And that is to be able to honor culture and explore well-being and inspire joy. And so that's the tagline, right? And that's how that came about. And that's my philosophy and approach. So I get to take families. I'm in the unschooling realm right now with my son. I use the pandemic as an opportunity to say, even though you have these 3 degrees, I've started to realize I went through my own deschooling process, and that I had to unlearn a lot of what I had learned throughout my career. And so that became a powerful shift in my own learning. And so we do these nature experiences that are led by often a person of color, Black and brown folks. And my work is in Nashville, Tennessee. And we have experiences like, what is a poultry farmer, right? So my grandparents were farmers, and usually I go to these nature centers and they're talking about birding. And I was like, well, I don't know any birders. Well, come to find out, I had to shift how I thought about birding, right? Like, what culturally does that mean for me and so many other people? And that can be the poultry farmer. So there's this Black woman who had all these birds, and like that little girl, I smiled because it was the same reaction that our children had, right? And seeing all these birds, and here's this Black woman from Chicago who has this farm with all these birds, right? So we explore that, and you think about the learning experiences that comes by just going and being in that space of how do you care for ducks? How do you, what do ducks need? What temperatures do eggs hatch at? All these rich experiences that the children were having just in that time was powerful, but then for her to talk about the importance of certain breeds and to talk about conservation, of certain breeds, that's powerful, right? And so there's so many other experiences that we were providing, but gardening for food justice. So I was at a community garden, and I live in a community garden now. And so we didn't just talk about planting for the sake of planting or growing food, but it was more from a perspective of a social justice perspective. Why do we grow food? Why do we create our own food systems? Looking at the work of Dr. Carver as a social justice worker, not just as the person who did this work with Keynote, right? So digging deeper and critically into those notions of people who have been in nature and spaces and their contributions, and uplifting that work, past and present, is very, very important. So I could go on, but there's, if you want to see some pictures and other examples of topics, ourjoyfullearning.com, there's a gallery of pictures from our different programs and events that we've had, and you can see what the children do. But I mean, literally, we probably spend 20 to 30 minutes talking with the individual who's leading it. And then the children are engaged in free play and their questions come up, and it's just joyful. It just is, and it fills my heart. So I encourage all of us, I think, on here to really go through that recipe, because I look at that, I'm like, that's exactly the pattern that I went through to arrive at that stage of creation and centering. And so I so appreciate that framework. So that's what it has looked like for me in practice.
Thank you so much. That is amazing, Ashley. And yeah, I love hearing about it as many times as I can, because it's so powerful and it's so inspiring, and it's so needed, right? And a lot of things that Takima mentioned that our children get denied, right? It's access to nature in ways that make them thrive and make them feel alive again, right? And for different reasons, but it's denial, right? There's a nature deficit in a lot of our communities, and that's something that we have to address as well too. So I'm really excited to have you share. All right, it looks like you're up, Lelania, because Megan had to step away for a second. So next up in our panel is Lelania Garcia, the kindergarten teacher who grounds her teaching in community justice and equity. She's a graduate of Yale University and Bank Street College of Education. When she isn't working with her kindergarten students, she is a gender and sexuality trainer, helping early childhood professionals and families to create expansive and supportive understandings of gender, sexuality, relationship, and family structure. Her online course, Rooted, offers contextual background and concrete strategies for anti-bias work in early childhood education. And her first book was so exciting, What We Believe, a Black Lives Matter Principles activity book, was recently published in 2020 by Lee and Low. I must say, for the longest time, Lelania was this mystical goddess who took the Black Lives Matter principles and put them in the early childhood language. And then we finally met in Minneapolis last summer at Free Lines for People, or 2 summers ago, right? And she became real and became a close friend. And now I get to organize with her and share her amazing work. Karen Davidson, the artist, and Lelania wrote this book and continue to produce a lot of the art and the language behind me, but really made the work we do accessible to young children. And I am forever grateful for that. So welcome, Lelania.
Thank you. Thanks to you all. I'm, of course, learning so much, which I knew. I'm just going to start and say that my first response to Kima's presentation is, I don't know if y'all can see this, but when you showed that picture of your kid in the water, this is me and my sister and my first little brother in a pool in Puerto Rico when we're probably I don't know, 7, 4, and 2. And there we are swimming, and just so much joy. And I had already kind of thought about that, when I was listening to you, and I was like, what do I really want to speak to? When you gave your recipe about centering joy, that's something I've been thinking about a lot, because people have been, for the last year and a half now, people are like, Lelania, I want some help with having a difficult conversation. I want your help with challenging conversations. How do I talk to kids about race? How do I talk to kids about gender? How do I talk to kids about family structure? How do we talk to kids about this? I need your help with these challenging conversations, these difficult things. And I realized that I'm happy to talk to people about that, but the framing, something wasn't sitting right with me. And then I realized, I'm like, wait a minute, my identity is not difficult. It's who I am. My identity is not challenging. My kids don't feel challenged when they talk about who they are. Like if you talk to a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old, I teach 5 and 6-year-olds, and you're like, what are the things that are important about you? They will happily tell you. They're not like, ooh, sorry, it's really hard for me to say these things about myself, right? And so often when we think about talking to children, we are bringing all of our grown-up baggage with us. We are bringing what we've internalized about systems of oppression, and sometimes we're bringing those systems of oppression with us. And even if we're not bringing those systems of oppression with us, we're bringing our adult understanding of them with us. But we need to also understand that it is the oppression that is the problem. It is not people's identity. Trans people are not a problem. Transphobia is a problem. These, like when we think about these things, like we cannot tell our children, oh, being Black is hard, but here's some things we'll do to talk about it. No, being Black is great. Being Asian is great. Being who you are is great. When we all take care of each other and when we all have a community where everyone gets what they need, then that's also great. That's not challenging. And for little kids, equity isn't challenging. Like the idea that everyone gets what they need. I mean, occasionally a kid will kind of wish that they had all the cookies, right? But they really, more than that, want to make sure that everybody gets a cookie that actually feels better to them. And adults have to do all of this like thinking to be like, well, sometimes people don't deserve a home or enough food. Wait, what? Right? Like kids are like, when you say that to children, they're like, excuse me? Like, all right, what's wrong with you? Why? Of course, everyone should have a place to live. Of course, everyone should have enough food. And this idea of just like centering joy is, I feel like not only is that meeting children where they are, but it is also helping them stay where we all need to get to so we can get to the place of liberation, right? Liberation is joy. And so, and kids have that, right? Like you watch that kid with the ducklings and like that, like all these pictures, like children have so much joy. And it's true, we live in a society that steals that joy from them. We live in a society that takes it away from them, sometimes violently. And that is the problem. The problem is not their joy. And I think it's so important that, that as early childhood educators, as we're centering this joy, we understand that, sure, we don't have to lie to children about what has happened because people have made choices to take away other people's joy or to make sure not everybody has what they want. But that's not the story. And I feel like that's what's hard for many of us, because many of us grew up in the United States in an education system that told us that Black people in the United States began with slavery and ended with civil rights. And along the way, many of them were killed. Yeah, that is really upsetting and depressing and traumatizing and challenging. That's difficult. But that's not the whole story. And because we're kind of bringing that with us, because we grew up through this educational system, we have to know that we need to give our kids something else, right? Like we don't need to educate kids for the world that we live in now, because the world we live in now needs to change. It's not okay. And when I talk about the principles, like this is the thing that always gets me so fired up about the principles, is that they're all affirmative things that we do, right? Like we are trans affirming, we are queer affirming, we use loving engagement and restorative justice. In the same way that we tell children, you know, use gentle hands, use walking feet, we don't tell them what we want them not to do, we tell them what we want them to do. And the principles are like, here's what we want. We want everyone to get what they need. And just reframing that in my head over the past couple of months, as I got like yet another email, it's like, I want to learn how to talk about difficult things. I'm like, let's think about that. If you want to talk to your kids about who they are, great. Let's talk to our kids about who they are. Let's talk about how we take care of each other. Kids love that. Every year in kindergarten, when I talk to 5 and 6-year-olds about like, what do communities need? What does our community need? Like, how do we make sure that kids and teachers feel good at school? They are full of information and they are full of great ideas. And it's not challenging or difficult or upsetting or oppressive. We don't have to do that. And they have really good imaginations. I'm often telling them that I need them to keep their imaginations, because grown-ups sometimes our imaginations are rusty, right? Like we grew up, if you grew up in this country, you grew up under white supremacy and capitalism and all these ideas of scarcity, right? Like when we see people being like, oh, but if those people get a minimum wage of $15, what does it mean for me? Well, maybe you should get paid more too, right? Like we do not need to be pushing each other down. We need to get together, because that is when people in power get shook. And that is why there's a backlash. But we have also know that like, ooh, we're doing something right, because this is where the power is, right? And so kids have that. And I feel like what we are all talking about today, and Takima, just like what you really brought to the fore was that like we have to think about what we have internalized and reflect on it and interrogate it. And then we have to make sure that our kids can do something else, right? That our classroom isn't perpetuating it. Our classroom is a place where children are children, where they're joyful, where they can talk openly about what they see. They can talk about gender, they can talk about race. They don't learn, oh, don't talk about it, it's not polite, right? They learn that our differences are things to be celebrated because we are different. And I don't have this quote in my head, but Bell Hooks says something about how dominator culture has done its best to make us afraid of difference, instead of understanding that when we have our shared values, that difference is where we find our strength and our joy. It's not quite like that because it's Bell Hooks and it's brilliantly put together, but just thinking about that. And I feel like this recipe, I'm so excited to put into place. And I learned some like more stuff and more books to add to my list of books that's like this long. But those are my first thoughts about what is happening here. So thank you all. And I'm so excited to be in this conversation with you.
Thank you, Elena. As always, you always bring the knowledge. Everyone, I just realized, I'm sorry, attendees, you can't see everything in the chat. It's only going to panelists, and we can see it. And the comments are great. And we will respond and share things for you guys to see as well, too. But thank you, that's so much. And we're going to keep this conversation going. If you have questions for any of the panelists and for our keynote, please enter them in the Q&A function. Put them in the Q&A function for questions, and we will get to them after we're done conversating a little bit more. Up next, I am very excited to introduce our third panelist for today, Megan Madison, author of Our Skin, a first conversation about race for young children. Oh my God, I love this book. Megan is a doctoral candidate, facilitator, and author in New York City. She is a trainer for the Center for Racial Justice and Education, the New York Early Childhood Professional Development Institute, and Bank Street Center on Culture, Race, and Equity. Megan recently completed a term on the governing board of NACCE, where she contributed to the development of their recent position statement on advancing equity in early childhood education. I know she's busily working on her doctorate, and I hated to bother her and ask her to do this, but can I tell you, like, I got this book, and then I think we were talking about it at a DEY meeting, and then Nancy got this book, and she's like, oh my God, we could develop an entire curriculum framework around this book. And then I told them, the gender book is coming out soon too, right? So we were so excited, and I said, well, I'm going to interrupt her doctoral studies to see if she can join this panel, because we were so excited. And I know Megan is not the only author, it's co-authored with some other folks, but I just love it. And, you know, I did your training one time before COVID, and that was really great too, to see you in action doing the racial justice training. And hopefully I'll get to send some Sarah Lawrence students there once we are back in person. But thank you so much for joining us, Megan.
Oh my goodness, my heart is so full, it's overflowing. What a generous introduction, and so much wisdom. My journal will be full tonight, reflecting on everything I've learned so far from you, Takima and Ashley and Lalenia. It feels like such an honor to be on this panel, because it feels like this is the place to be. Like this is like the who's who of racial equity in early childhood education in 2021. And to be included in this party feels like such an honor. And something I am also deeply appreciating about this party is the deep recognition from every single one of us that we didn't invent this party. The party started way before us. And like what I'm thinking about from your presentation, Takima, is this metaphor of the recipe, and how the recipes that I can do best, I learned not from a cookbook, but in relationship to elders. So I just want to explicitly like slow down again and shout out, like, thank you for naming Beverly Daniel Tatum. Thank you for naming Ijima Jordan, who I also want to acknowledge brings a deep knowledge of the infant and toddler piece of this conversation. Sometimes we talk in early childhood as if the folks like us who started in pre-K classrooms and then got experience with older kids, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, hold all the expertise, but there's so much expertise among the folks who are working with infants, who are working with toddlers, and we need to reach out and build up and lift up those voices. Thank you for naming Tara Jean Yazzie Mintz. Thank you for naming Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. Thank you also to it got me thinking about who are my mentors, who are the actual, I didn't just read their books, but I read their books and then I went to conferences and I hunted them down in the hallways and I asked if they would be my friends and then they sat down and supported me, So I want to thank Carol Brunson Day and Louise Sturman Sparks and Aisha Ray and Enid Lee and Gloria Ladson Billing. This work, I think for a lot of folks in our field and a lot of white people in the United States, the issue of systemic racism is a new thing, and that can give the false appearance that this is a new thing, that we're inventing something new. And yes, there are new contributions, right? Lalena's genius translating the principles of the Black Lives Matter movement into kid-friendly language, that is a new iteration on the edge of our current movement for racial justice. And the work started a long time ago, and that we are going to be only stronger and more powerful when we continue to honor and recognize and build on the contributions of all those brilliant thinkers who came before us and are still around today, waiting for my phone call because I'm supposed to call Carol and give her an update about my dissertation progress. I owe you, Carol. Thank you for your patience. So, all right, I was thinking about relationships and recipes. I was thinking about this invitation to Kima about reflection. And so I grew up in the Midwest, in Northern Michigan with my white mom. And so I'm used to a real kind of white Midwestern culture of recipes being you want one thing of sour cream and one bag of Mexican cheese and one other, 2 cups of sugar, and very pre-packaged, all the work is done for you. You just unzip, scoop out, mix together, and that's your recipe. And so I empathize with folks who yearn for that in the work of racial equity work in early childhood, who are like, Megan, Melania, Takima, just give me the worksheet, give me the script, right? I can deeply empathize with that yearning. And I also am trying to tap into also one of the fondest memories I have from my white mom is our blueberry pie recipe. That was her mom's recipe. And that we would cook together every summer when we went out blueberry picking together. And then we came home and we washed the blueberries and we made, and that's a recipe I know by heart. And the recipe for challah that I bake every Friday afternoon that I learned from my mother-in-law, a white Jewish woman, right? And that recipe I know so much by heart that I can play around with it. I know how to do that recipe in different climates because it matters. I know how to do that recipe with a little bit more sugar, a little less sugar, or if I use gluten-free flour because I have someone who has a gluten allergy coming to my home. And that those recipes that I've learned to play around with, I just think that metaphor is really, really powerful for racial equity work. And I'm very grateful for you offering it to Kima. And I'm thinking about boundaries in recipes. My ex-husband and I had an ongoing silly debate about what is a salad? He grew up in Northern California. So salad was what many people think of as salads. It has to include at least one vegetable. Me growing up with white people in the Midwest, salad could include sugar and sour cream. It did not necessarily need to involve a vegetable of any kind. And so I think we're also in that moment when we're thinking about racial equity in early childhood. And I think the definitions you provided, Takima, of you actually have to understand and have analysis of white supremacy and whiteness in the United States. That, if you don't have that and you just have different colored dolls and multicolored crayons, you're not actually doing anti-racist work or racial equity work in early childhood education. You have to have an understanding of settler colonialism. Those are foundational elements of the recipe. They're not optional. There's lots of stuff you can play around with at the edges, and then there's some ingredients that it's not lasagna without pasta in it, and I feel like we're at that kind of moment. And then I'm also thinking about this metaphor of how do we know when it's good, right? And it's, for me, when I'm cooking, I know I've succeeded not when I've like done the recipe to a T, but I know what I've done is when I'm sharing the food that I have made with the people that I love, if there is laughter and joy, if people are sitting back in their chairs, if they are feeling nourished and sustained by what I have provided, that's my indicator that I've done a good job. So it's helpful to have like indicators, like, did I put enough salt? You know, did I do this? Did we read, you know, the book that everybody's reading right now? If another person asks me, have you read Cast yet? I'm going to scream. Maybe, I don't know. It doesn't, like, it's not about that, right? It's about, do the people in my community who are sitting around my table feel nourished and sustained by the racial equity work? And we know when we look around, we know it when we see it. And does it taste good? I'm also thinking about this joy piece that Lalania and Takima and Ashley, like, you all spoke on so beautifully. Like, it's not good racial equity work in my mind if it doesn't taste good. Like, if people are feeling if we're working so fast and like that people are feeling exhausted and we're so urgent about it that people are feeling exhausted, that's not the kind of racial equity work I want us to do. If we're making people feel bad or guilty, we want to create room, as you mentioned, Takima, for a full range of human emotions. And like grief, fear, loss, anger are real parts of the journey. And like a deep sense of integrity and satisfaction and joy should also be there. Like, I want anti-racists to come to our diversity and equity meeting and want to come back next time. For me, that's like the sign that something good is happening. I think I'm looking at my notes. I took so many notes from the conversation, and also it's very, very hot. Hopefully you can see that I'm like sweating. Thank you all for basking in my glow of the ring light plus the sweat plus the 90-degree New York City heat. Yeah, I think that's pretty much the most important things I had to say. Thank you all for listening. I can't wait to like answer questions and talk with each other.
Thank you so much, Megan. Oh my God, I'm just loving these food recipes, the metaphor, this whole idea. It made me think of, and I just have to shout out this book. If you have not read, and I'm not saying like that, and it's a fiction book. So Elizabeth Acevedo, With the Fire on High, is one of my favorite young adult books ever. She writes about this young teenager in New York City who can cook and make you feel such emotions from food. And like, as I'm reading it, like I'm tearing up. And so as you spoke about your recipe, it made me think about that book. So I just have to say that. And so yes, we are compiling a list of everybody mentioned. First, I love that Ashley shouts out Dr. Tara-Jean Yazzie-Mintz, because she was on my dissertation committee, and I'm so fortunate. I didn't get to work with her as much as I want because she left Indiana, but she stayed on my committee, and that was just amazing. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, I still have so many of her books I'm trying to read about portraiture and methodology. Gloria Latza-Billings, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, I use one of her books every semester in my class. So such great people. We'll add to it, and then you guys can also add to it, but we'll get that list going out to everyone as well too. So thank you so much. So great, so much. Oh my God, there was just so much that everyone talked about that's so moving and so inspiring. But I was thinking of like who might be in the audience, right? So, and thinking about the work we do. And so one of the things I thought about, I wanted us to freedom dream a little bit, but I also want us to make asks of the people who are here, right? So we have a lot of educators in the audience, a lot of white people who identified as white people in the chat. What is something that white people in this work, in this space, can do to support you and your work in centering joy and care? Like, what's an ask that we can make of people? What would it look like for early childhood teachers, college professors like myself, nonprofit professionals, right? People doing this work, retired teachers. We have an amazing group of retired teachers and still current teachers. What could they do to support us in this work of centering joy and centering care? What would you love to see? Like, if you were freedom dreaming and I was giving you wishes and granting you whatever you wanted, what would it look like for you? And my dog's barking, so I'm gonna mute.
I mean, I think one thing that is so important, I'm sorry, Megan, is just what Kim said earlier about like letting children be children, like letting all children be children. Because I feel like a thing that I see and worked very hard to eradicate in myself, and I know that I have not done it all, is just the adultification of Black kids. And this is something else that happens, is this idea that we have to make sure that children of color are smaller and take up less space because the world is unkind. No, we need to fix the world. And I feel like so much of what we do sometimes comes from this place of like wanting to protect children, which is a legitimate thing to want to do, but we cannot tell children to stop being themselves because the world will be unkind. And we cannot tell children that like some kids can play and some kids can't. And that like when some, like I feel like often like when little white boys shout out, people respond to them or just like tell them like their turn. But when little girls shout out, they get a lecture about raising their hand. Mm-hmm. And I watch, like one thing that's so interesting that happens at like around 5 and 6 is that I watch kids start to pay attention and to have like really internalize these ideas that like little boys get to run around and little girls don't. And it's not because little girls don't want to, it's because no one tells little boys to stop, right? Like letting all of our children be children. And that means letting them be loud, letting them be dirty, letting them be tender, letting them be loving, right? Like patriarchy is bad for everybody. Like it's not good for little boys either. And I feel like particularly for like little Black girls, there's this idea of like mothering that gets pushed on them. People are like, oh, she could take over the class. Mm-hmm. And we think of it as a compliment. We think of it as something that is positive. And it's not that it's not positive, but maybe that little Black girl doesn't want to take over the class. Maybe she wants to be a little girl. She wants to be a little kid, just like everyone else. And just allowing kids to really be kids and noticing if we're stopping them from playing. Because I think stopping kids from playing is something that our society teaches us to do. And a lot of us might have learned in teacher school about like managing kids rather than allowing kids, right? So just like, that would be my biggest ask. Even though it's not really about me, but I just feel like when those kids can do that, because I watch these kids and they can, like, I feel like these kids are gonna grow up to change the world if they are allowed to. So that would be really good for me personally and for everybody else. So people might have some other ideas, but that's just the thing that I thought about like right now.
So good. I
love
love
it.
that.
Jump in, everyone.
I think one thing I was thinking of is it feels rare for me to have an opportunity to be on an all-Black panel, and it would be great if white people would let us not talk about their needs right now. Like I think there's a lot of times we've been really generous in offering resources and thinking already, and yeah, I get the eagerness, and maybe underneath it there's also some anxiety, like I need more help, I don't want to mess up, but like I don't, it would be lovely to have 20 minutes where I don't feel asked to hold the nurturing and the guidance and the calming of white people's curiosity, needs, and anxieties in this moment.
That is real. That is real truth. I've been to panels. I know Bettina Love has done this with the Abolitionist Teaching Network, where they're not taking those questions from the audience. There was a separate panel for white teachers to talk to white people and answer those questions. That was not the panel that she was having with the Black educators, and it was very clear. So thank you. I respect that a lot, Megan. How about you, Ashley?
I was thinking about this. I was looking at Leilana's comment about pay Black women, right? And it's interesting in the early childhood space, like this, all of this is goodness, right? All these folks here on this panel are is goodness. And yet when I see panels from other organizations, many organizations, we tend to uplift the same few people who are doing the work. So it looks like there's only like 3 people doing the work. And I think all of us on here are surrounded by incredible people doing great work. And so when you all are looking for professional development, you know, we just don't talk about Black stuff, you know, or, you know, other things. Like I have experiences that are crucial and important to all children. So I'm able to provide that professional learning and development that is necessary and important for all teachers and for all children. And so I think that's a big one for folks to really think about is, oh, we have this little pot of money set aside for DEI work. We got to find this one Black. No, we have the capacity and we do this work every day that is important for every single type of professional development that you want to provide to teachers, to your teachers. And so, yeah, and our experiences just center ourselves in the children that we work with. But it's relevant for every single piece, social emotional development, all of those things that we know are important for children's whole well-being, we can talk about. So I would encourage people to think about that too. It's like, don't cap us just for those conversations.
Yeah, that's so true, right? You get asked to do the same thing. Like Lelania talked about how we get all these asks right before Black History Month. Everybody wants that 90-minute come solve all of our racial work problems. And, it's actually changing. I know us in Black Lives Matter at School, the National Steering Committee, we're really trying to set boundaries around that. Like, we're not coming in to do this quick 60 minutes. Like, you need to show us your intentionality to move your organization in places before we agree to work with you. We're not a Band-Aid. We're not a one-stop, come in the shortest month of the year, get yourself, check we woke, we did our Black Lives Matter panel, keep it moving. Right. This is long-term work. We've all been investing in doing this work for so long, and we're happy to help and we want to help, right? But even my students get 2 years from me, right, before I send them off into the world, right? This takes time. It's not something that can be done. And there's a lot of breadth to the work that we do, right? I miss just talking about early childhood curriculum construction, the project approach, and problem-based learning, and all that fun stuff that used to be what, I talked about a lot. And now it's like people only want you to talk about this one thing. Or play, which play we've been talking about for 2 days. Play we're going to always talk about, right? Let's center that as well too, because that's super important. And Takima, feel free to come off mute, and they'll bring you back into this if you want to share or stay. You gave an amazing keynote, but I think for you, I guess it's that recipe. Like, how do we do all of those things? Like, give space for all of those things to happen as well too.
Let me just tell you that I had to get some popcorn.
I saw you eating the popcorn.
I was listening to that. I said, wait a minute now. This panel, let me get some popcorn, because y'all are just really going there. And I really appreciated so much. Everything that you said has just been so powerful. Everything could be tweetable, put on a t-shirt, put up in a wall in a classroom. It made me think. And just be honored to be doing this work with you all. I'm thinking about the panel that I was recently invited to be a part of, that when I looked at the list, because it was about 2 weeks before the panel was starting, which was curious. There were about 40 people, and I was like, oh, you need a not white person to be on your panel. Fascinating. And so we do endure quite a bit. And I just appreciated your statement, Megan, but this also speaks to my point of whiteness, right? When we said that we are all socialized into whiteness, and so we might not think about the fact that in many cases we are centering the needs of white folks in equity work until we realize it, re-socialize ourselves, and then say the uncomfortable words. And people have to then sit with that and think about what that means. And I know that Wendy, I realized that attendees can't see the chat, which is so unfortunate. I wish that they could. But Wendy said, I'm here, duly noted. And Wendy is a white educator and director who was on day one. And so we need the comrades to be doing this work within their own communities as well. So thanks.
Yes, and we have a lot, right? As I mentioned, Peter Rovlich is a retired, I messed up your name again, Peter, I'm sorry. He was in last year's panel, retired New York teacher who's now in North Carolina and doing amazing work to stop the preschool suspension and expulsion, or not just school extension and expulsion in the younger grades in North Carolina. And so that kind of like commitment, seeing but elevating the voices, right? Reading Black Lives Matter at School and getting educators to read that and talk about it and doing that. And so that if people are out there doing it, and I suggest calling on those people, right, and supporting them and helping them, but then also thinking about how are you reaching out to other people in general is so important too. So one of the questions in the audience was about, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit, but that we've all been through this path, right? And so April asked, how did you educators make this shift? So I thought that was a nice question to think about. Like, how did we make the shift to where we are now? I'll begin if you don't mind. I'll take a little moderator privilege and just share quickly. So I mentioned the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. I have both the 20th anniversary copy and the original. When I got the original copy, I had just moved to DC from New Jersey. I was in undergrad working at UDC on my early child degree. And a friend gave it to me and he wrote this inscription or whatever. And I was like, all right, so I start reading it. And like, I'm in chapter 1. And she pretty much says like racism, like everybody who benefits from racism is racist. And I threw the book down because I was still very much a colorblind Black girl from New Jersey who thought that race didn't matter and that we just all should get along, right? And it took me years, like 2.5 more years in my undergrad program at a historically Black college university to pick the book back up again, read that part again and be like, whoa, right? This is right. And I have to tell people that. I grew up in a white culture that told me that if I didn't talk about being Black, people wouldn't notice it. That was a lie. They always notice and they always brought it up. But I was socialized to think I shouldn't bring it up and I shouldn't notice it and it would just go away, right? And to operate in the world that way. And so it took going back and reading and listening. I had amazing professors at my undergrad institution that helped me to really see that and really challenge those notions of what it means to be Black in America. And then, to just really listen to other people too, and listen to other people's experiences and see how different they were. And sometimes it's similar, but different from mine, and to really accept that, right? That everybody's situation is different. So that's what really got me started. And of course, listening and working with the youth, right? And hearing them talk about school. I was a nerd. I love school. Obviously, I'm a professor, like duh. But it wasn't like that for everyone else. And I could never understand why. And then I realized because they're not often treated the way I was treated, right? I was the person that the teacher knew she could count on to get the question right, to keep things going. So I had a different relationship with the educator than other Black children, right? Who weren't seen that way, who weren't seen as smart, who weren't seen as capable. And so their relationships were very different. So that really helped me to then think about all of these things and kind of change my perspective and keep going. So I'll share that, but I'd love to hear from you guys about, how did you get onto this journey where we're at here?
I think it was a series of shifts, right? We talk about it's a journey. And so there's just like several shifts that'll keep happening. And I think the biggest shift probably came, unfortunately, not until my doctoral program, where I had to teach that multicultural education course, and which is a very difficult course to teach because you're talking about identities. And when you haven't been, oriented into doing that work, and you're kind of just thrown in the gauntlet, to teach, you're figuring yourself out as you're teaching it. And you're realizing how much you yourself have harbored. At least that was what my experience was of the culture of white supremacy. And so it's like you're learning and unlearning at the same time. And in fact, it wasn't until I wrote this paper or a presentation called, it was kind of like learning by unlearning or something at the time. And I wrote, it was like an autoethnography or autobiography of my journey at that time. And so I would write a vignette from the past of something that I had recalled of my upbringing, and then writing something presently. And I did that in a series. And I think that was like the major point of shift, was doing that work. And I think that for a lot of people, one of the things we required in courses when I went on to continue to teach work, not even just, multicultural education courses, it was like intro to early childhood, all of those things that are important. It was like, you have to start with yourself and dig in. And that often was through writing. And it was because you go into this very deep reflective period with some very poignant reflective questions. So it goes back to that, number one in the recipe, right? That reflection. And that's when it really started for me, was during that time. And it's just been continuous. And last year, I would say, was another major shift, right? Into like, oh, you learned all of that stuff. Now, look at it through this other lens. And so it's a constant journey of unlearning.
I can share, as probably the oldest person on this panel, that in the beginning, I mentioned that I was really brought into this understanding of race and racial identity through my work with Dr. Tatum and Dr. Sandra Lawrence when I was in college. And so it really just became a foundational part of my personality and how I viewed the world. However, I went into a graduate program right after college. Literally 3 weeks later, I went to Bank Street to do my master's, my first master's in early childhood and elementary education. So I'll tell you the year because it's relevant. It was 1995. So do you know what didn't exist in 1995? Literally in any form that you would ever recognize? The internet and cell phones and virtual connection and the world being as small and at your fingertips, because I would go to Google and be like, what? No, Google didn't exist. I would go to Netscape and look for something, and then it would do this right? You remember the old, like, I'm old. And so Wendy knows. And so imagine in, I think it was January of my first year being in this classroom of threes, where I was like, something is not sitting right with me. I'm not like, how am I making sense of my own racial identity in this context of trying to teach preschool? And I got Gloria Ladson-Billings' book, The Dream Keepers. And I was like, mind is blown. But then I went to work the next day and I was like, I still don't know what to do. And I went through the rest of my graduate program and I would read books, actual books, there were no ebooks, and try to engage and figure things out. But the missing piece for me when I went into teaching directly, you know, I was a head teacher after a while, it was like, how do I translate what I now understand to be my values and my understanding of myself as a racialized being within the context of what I knew also, didn't really call it white supremacist, but I knew about like racism and systemic racism. I had studied that enough in college and in life. But how does that translate into what's happening with these children in front of me? And so it's been something that I've interrogated in many ways alone in the beginning of my journey. And there have been external points that have happened in society that then have shifted and allowed me to deepen the work. And so that's what racial identity development is about, right? You have your own process internally of how you see yourselves, but then external events will then shift your development just as an adult. And as you all get older, you will see, right? You go through different phases. And so I think a key piece for me was the shifting jobs and going into teacher education for preschool and realizing that I had all these people in front of me that were going to go and teach children in New York City. And I could talk to them about different ways of approaching it. Didn't have the level of analysis that I have now, but I was still able to push. We were still able to say, okay, Piaget, like, is this for everyone? Who's missing? Do we know he studied his kids? Is that everybody? Is that what you're, you know? So we were able to start pushing that critical reflexivity. Again, I don't know that I was able to give them concrete things to move into the classroom with, but that didn't stop me from having my journey. And so essentially moving jobs has shifted how I've been able to view and deepen. And then becoming a parent to a Black boy was the key thing for me. I think that really shifted it to, I've got to get it together. This also aligned with the internet and just being able to be connected to people in ways that now allow us to take the theoretical frameworks and processing and understanding it and really translating it into very clear, actionable steps and behaviors. And that's what I'm so grateful to all of you for, you know, in your own ways have created essentially a roadmap of how to put this work into practice. But we can't just look at the books. Like, to your point, Megan, like, we can't just read Cast, and we can't just, like, you can't just live it in your head, because every single day you wake up and you take a breath is an opportunity to work towards equity in everything you do and to live in full alignment for the service of children and families and for this world. And so that is the key for me. Like, I don't know that I want to go back to pre-internet days, but I will say, like, putting in the work is what has gotten me to this place. And I know what it's what gets everyone to, you know, the continued growth that we're all doing this journey for.
I feel like both of those really made me reflect. So like, on my journey, like as Ashley said, like it is like several like moments that are important. Like I remember being 19 years old and reading Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks for the first time, and all of a sudden a whole new way of thinking was introduced to me. And I'm a person who really needs language. Like, language informs thought for me. And a lot of folks like imagine all sorts of things, but if somebody hasn't given me language for it, I really struggle with it. So like that was like the beginning of my understanding. But I also like had a similar childhood to Tanisha's, where like I was in mostly white spaces and I got a lot of compliments for not being like other Black people, right? Like that was a thing. And then I remember having moments of like understanding that I'd obviously internalized some racism, and how did I feel about that? And then also like thinking at 15 with no analysis about like, I'm like, is classist a word? I think I'm classist, but I don't know if that's a thing. It's like I just didn't have space. I didn't have the words. And college was really great because I got a lot of that vocabulary that helped me think about these intersections, and that Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks were already doing all of that. And it was great that they had done that for me. And then after college, I moved to New York and got to be with queer community and with queer people of color. And I think community is the thing that has been so important for me, because I got to be in community. And meanwhile, I'm teaching. Like I went to Bank Street, I was teaching, I was in several different places. And then I worked at charter school for a while. And I remember the day that many of us were talking about the independence we wanted our children to have as students. And then someone said, you can't do that with these kids. And I was like, oh, these kids. Because I had started off at Bank Street. I worked at the Bank Street School for Children. I was in a progressive place with mostly white children. Those kids were allowed to have independence. I thought all children should have independence. But then I was at a place where I was told, no, these children. And I knew exactly what they meant when they said these children. And that was hard. And I remember leaving because I thought, I am being asked to do things that are harmful to children. And I remember leaving that place. And I went to some other places. And then 8 years ago, I landed at a place that nurtured me, that allowed me to bring my whole self, my whole Black, Puerto Rican, middle class, thinking about like, what does it mean to like have grown up speaking only English? Like all of that was welcomed into the classroom. And all my children were supposed to bring their whole selves in. And so then I could practice. And so I had a community of educators that allowed me space with children. And one of the things that I have said is that like, what I was needing is the space to be left to work with children in the ways that I felt was most powerful and most good for children, like really centering children. And being allowed to center children is something that we don't all get to do in our classrooms, which is something that I know is really deeply difficult for many of us, right? When somebody has to ask us, when we know someone's gonna come and talk to us about how we're teaching, right? When I closed my door, because we were having a conversation about where meat came from, but it wasn't on my lesson plan, and I was worried that but the kids asked, and they were engaged. It was a great conversation. And in progressive schools, that's what we do. And then having the space to watch kids like be socialized or to fight against their socialization, to know that they were there while I kind of stumbled through things. And so I feel like that has been the most important part of my journey, is that there are actual children who are being people. And I feel like the most valuable thing that I learned at Bank Street was that children are human beings that are worthy of respect. It's not about like, I'm not in early childhood because like it's cute and I like to play with kids, which is what a lot of people say, right? Like I do like to play with kids. I think it's important, but I feel like there is a deep respect for children. And Takima, when you mentioned that idea of like this disdain for childhood, it is so ingrained in Western culture and in American culture. Like people do not respect children, and it's so harmful. But finding places where I can respect children and watching what they do with it, that's where, like, I think that has been part of the most important part of my journey. And the thing that I'm feeling a little bit sad about is that that's hard to replicate. Like, I know I got lucky. And I have been in places that did not allow me to do that, and I had the privilege to leave. But not everybody has that privilege. And so, like, when I think, like, big picture things, I'm just like, how do we get it so that teachers get to do what is right for the children in their care? Because I deeply believe that the vast majority of teachers want to do that, and many of us are actively prevented, and many of the ones who don't want to do it, it's because someone stopped them. Someone stopped them for years and years and years. And so people are trying to figure out how to get around. And like, that's where I run up against like, ugh, like that's my existential despair, is like, how teachers know how to do it. How do we get people to leave teachers alone? Like, how do we respect children enough to give them people who care about them to take care of them? That was a little bit more. That was my soapbox.
No, that was amazing. It was amazing.
Yeah, I would sit at the edge of your soapbox for hours and hours and hours. And I love this question. And I love thinking in metaphors and making everything a metaphor and just zooming out. Like the fact that we decided to take this space and almost like this is what sometimes a really good racial affinity space feels like to me, is when we share our stories and we notice what are the connections, what are the disconnections, and having access to some of those spaces throughout my journey has been really pivotal. I'm like listening to your story, Lelania, and feeling so jealous that you had access to Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks as a teenager. Like, I didn't have access to that until, like, in Ashley, your story, like, in grad school. And I remember reading it and just sitting in my bed and crying. Like, I'm not the only Black queer woman who's ever existed. Like, that someone else has named these experiences. Like, the intersection of racism and patriarchy, like, is so clearly named. Like, it was so powerful. I had one of those Takima moments of, like, whoa! And a similar moment when someone finally put Dream Keepers and Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria in front of me. But I came into the work of social justice through my family. There were like gender nonconforming members of my family, and I identify as cisgender. I didn't have that word at the time, but I knew that the gender I was assigned at birth happened to align or match with the gender I felt inside. And I felt this deep sense of like, oh, the world is not fair for the people that I love. And I need to do some research and find community and make the world more fair, because that's not okay. And that was a lot of personal work I was doing. And then the intellectual work I was doing was I ended up in college. I graduated high school 2005. Titans Will Strive into 2005. And that was when there was a real time when the United States was engaging in a new form of imperialism internationally, in particular in the Middle East. And I grew up in Michigan, so there was a lot of, University of Michigan was near a community where there were a lot of Arabic speakers, and so there was lots of recruitment, lots of talk about 9/11, and so I ended up doing my thesis on U.S. imperialism, particularly in the Middle East. And that's the first time I think I got radicalized, that I was like, oh, there's a big system of power that's unfair. But then I graduated with this degree in religions, and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with that. Like, I just need a job. And Teach for America was recruiting. And I think at the time, naively, I thought like, oh, racism is like, I didn't have words. I was like, it's inside imperialism. Like the way the United States treats Black people is the way that the United States treats like the global South. So I thought, oh, these people have a theory of change. I'll get involved in Teach for America. I'll address racism in my own country. And similarly, had that experience like you were talking about, Lelania, of being asked to teach in ways that felt really bad to my soul, that were soul crushing. Treating Black and brown kids in ways that I was like, I know y'all are all about racial justice, but this doesn't feel like racial justice to me. And I remember being in my teacher ed program and having a professor basically harass me as a Black person, and blowing up at him, and then being asked to apologize to him because I hurt his feelings. And so I successfully got myself, but I also didn't know about community organizing. So I thought, the little models I had growing up of like, how do you make change in the world? I was like, well, I guess you just have to be like Martin Luther King. You have to work all by yourself and just stand up and say what the right thing is. And then everyone will go like, oh, you're right, that was racist, we're sorry, and fix it. Turns out that's not an accurate telling of the story, but that's the story I learned growing up. So that's what I tried in Teach for America. I like sent an angry email to the Teach for America people, and I was like, this is racist, you should stop. And then I just got kicked out of the program. So I learned the hard way that community organizing and relationships is a better approach. Fast forward a bunch of years, end up in New York, getting connected to community, learning about community organizing, deepening my racial justice analysis, going to grad school, and building relationships with people like my mentor, Ijima Jordan, who also has a very different story. I think lots of us on this panel happen to be people for whom maybe a critical consciousness came later in life. We were denied that growing up. But that's not true for all Black people. Like Ichim was like, no, my mom was a Black Panther. We talked about this in our home since day one. And so like having access to relationships with people who have different stories and mentorship helped equip me with that vision that you talked about, Takima, of like what I can do now for other educators I'm in relationship with and other young children and other people, my family, people that I love, is try to create a world where people didn't have to learn quite as hard as the way that I learned it, and quite as late, that we can talk about it from a very early age.
Oh, I love that. So much wisdom. So we're running out of time. There were a couple questions that I don't know. We talked about it for 2 days and I don't know how to, I'm just going to put a stab out there, right? So one of them was about deficit views around Black and brown children and access to play. And I'm just going to quite clearly ask people, when you hear that, you need to call it out for what it is. You need to say, what I hear you saying is a deficit racist idea that Black and brown children are not entitled to the same privileges and rights and access of white children. And we need to just say that, right? Jamal Bowman ended our talk yesterday by saying that. We need to be clear when we hear the deficit narratives, the racist ideas, and get people to repeat them back. So what you're saying is Black and brown children do not deserve to play because they're not white, or they weren't born white, or they don't have the advantages of white. Like, get them to say it back to them, right? And we just need to be explicit about that. And we do that through our principle of loving engagement, right? How we respond. What I hear you saying is this, and I'm going to challenge that because that is not okay, right? That's a people have to understand that's a racist idea to subscribe to. And you start with calling it a deficit, and then we connect to how it's racist. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add on it, but I don't want to end on that note, right? But I know that was coming up for people. And there was also a question about infants and toddlers. I'm sorry, Azuma was part of our panel last year and I didn't get to bring her back this year. And I know she has a lot of expertise with infant and toddlers. I don't know if anyone else wants to take a stab at this. I don't know if it's in anyone else's background. It's not in mine, unfortunately. I was very much kindergarten and moved forward. But if we have any resource or anything like that, we can definitely share. But I would like us to end with just thinking about, what's this look like for us in the future, right? What do we see when we go through our steps and we go through the recipe and we do all this, like I don't want to limit you to one word, maybe a short sentence, right? About what this looks like and feels like and tastes like and touches like for you in the future, right? So for me, I keep continuing with my same phrase, which is, it looks like play is freedom and play is liberation. And I just believe that that's what we give young children and that's what we get, right? We give them that freedom and we liberate them in ourselves too.
For me, it's like a flourishing garden. There's lots of different ways that people are doing it in their own ways, and that they're living together in kind of right relationship, and there's like symbiotic relationships of support between the different modalities to which people are building and creating racial justice in early childhood.
Love it.
I guess for me, I think about uplifting what's in your community, right? And the people who are doing the good work in your community. You don't have to go all over US to find it. It's literally in your backyard, and it may not be someone who has a title like we do, but it's the next door neighbor who has knowledge and skills that often get overlooked, right? And so tapping into that and understanding that all of our communities have good, no matter what they look like, and those folks can help us on our journey with children.
I think something that what I hope this looks like is that not only can children have the liberation to play, but everyone can, right? Like, I think that we only allow some children to play, and we only allow children to play. And sometimes we do that because we're like, well, you have to get ready to be a grown-up, right? There's a lot of like, you have to not play because you got to do this other stuff. But like, I think if we could all play and like have that sense of abundance, there's enough for everybody, so we can all play and we can all uplift each other and like have symbiotic relationships with each other, like that would be like that's my utopia.
It's hard to pick one thing, but for me, I think that we can all wake up and recenter ourselves away from thinking about the oppressive structures and lives that we live that exist, and recenter to say, what is the vision that could be created? If we could like let go of those structures of all the things that exist that we need to try to like fold ourselves into, well, there's going to be testing and there's going to be but what if there isn't? Because if we don't keep our eye on the prize of the vision, then it's impossible for us to actually keep taking steps forward. We're actually being swayed and pulled by the oppressive structures that want it to stay the same. And so I want to wake up and say, this is me, this is who I am, and my Black self, and my Brooklyn self, and my viewing children as beautiful, creative, joyful beings. And I want to give them the world that they deserve. So let's just recenter.
I love that. Thank you so much. This is it. This is day 3, y'all. I hope that this has been a great experience. I know for some of you, we didn't really address all the questions that you wanted, but we can't expect us 5 women to solve the complex problems of public schools and education in 2 hours. So forgive me if we didn't address your questions specifically, but the work continues. And I think we gave you a lot to build with and to start with, and just to know there are no easy solutions. If anyone tells you they can solve all your problems, they're the liar. Don't fall for the okie doke, right? It takes work. It takes continuing challenge, and it takes building community, which I think we've all heard. Defending the earlier, there's a community that's taking on this challenge, and we welcome you to join us and everyone else. So I want to begin. Thank you so much to Kima Bunch-Smith for your amazing keynote. To our panelists, Ashley Brailsford, Lalenia Garcia, and Megan Madison, thank you all so much. I want to shout out again our tech team, Jiro and Felicia in their studio for the amazing work. My co-director, Blakely Bundy, behind the scenes, but just keeping us going. Our marketing guru person, Catherine Fig, as well, who keeps us going. Our amazing co-founder, Nancy Carlson Page and Diane Levin. I'm sure there's our return to the board treasurer, Geraldine, and our newest member to the board, Keisha Reed. I want to thank everyone and all of our advisory board members and just all of our supporters in general, and all of you who've taken the time out for the past 3 days to attend this event. I see you, Rosalie Riyadh. I see you in the audience. Thank you so much, Wendy, for coming back. For everyone, Jim, I know you're out there. Hope you're still around. Thank you all so much from the bottom of our hearts. Please look for all of the references that we talked about to be emailed, as well as links to the recordings to everyone who registered. We will get those out to you probably after the holiday, so probably sometime next week. But thank you all so much.